Daniel and I had been married for 12 years. 12 years of highs and lows, moments of intimacy and distance. But never once had I questioned his love for me. He was the kind of man who worked late, thrived on pressure, yet never forgot to brew my morning coffee before leaving for the office. Those small gestures had become the rhythm of our marriage. The sound of the coffee maker gurgling to life at 6:30 a.m., the gentle kiss on my forehead before he slipped out the door, the way he'd text me during his lunch breaks just to say he missed me. These were the threads that wove our life together. Ordinary, precious, irreplaceable. That Tuesday morning started like any other. The cup was still warm on the granite counter when the phone rang, steam curling lazily upward like incense. I was upstairs, sorting through Daniel's shirts for the dry cleaner, when the shrill sound cut through the quiet house. I almost didn't answer. Something about that particular ring felt different, more insistent, more ominous. My hand hesitated over the receiver, as if my subconscious already knew what was coming. "Mrs. Carter, we regret to inform you," the voice belonged to someone from Daniel's company. Professional, clinical, rehearsed in delivering the worst possible news. 3 words shattered everything. Heart attack. Daniel had collapsed at his mahogany desk on the 42nd floor, a Mont Blanc pen still clutched in his hand, a merger contract half read, coffee still warm in his favorite navy mug, the one I'd given him for our 5th anniversary. He was only 48. The world tilted sideways. I remember sliding down the bedroom wall, the phone clattering to the hardwood floor, and the sound of my own voice. High, keening, animalistic, filling the suddenly hollow house. This couldn't be real. Daniel was supposed to come home tonight. We were supposed to discuss the weekend plans, maybe catch a movie. How could he just stop existing? That first night, I wandered through our house like a ghost, touching everything he had touched. His reading glasses on the nightstand, his shoes kicked carelessly by the front door, the morning newspaper folded to the business section, his coffee ring still visible on the wood. Each object felt sacred and unbearable at the same time. St. Mary's Cathedral was packed to capacity. Daniel's colleagues filled the oak pews, their faces masks of appropriate solemnity. The air was thick with the cloying scent of white lilies. Hundreds of them, their petals already browning at the edges under the stained glass light. I sat in the front row, numb, more shadow than woman, listening to words that seemed to float past me without meaning. Devoted husband, brilliant businessman, taken too soon. The phrases felt hollow, inadequate to capture the man who used to sing off-key in the shower and cry during dog movies. Helen Carter sat beside me, rigid in her black Chanel suit, her silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon. She hadn't shed a single tear, not even when the pastor spoke of Daniel's childhood, of his first steps, his graduation from law school. Instead, she sat with her hands folded, her pale blue eyes scanning the crowd like a general surveying troops. I kept waiting for her to break down, to show some crack in her porcelain composure. After all, she had lost her only son. But there was something calculating in her stillness that made my skin crawl. Even in grief, Helen Carter was always planning her next move. During the service, I caught fragments of whispered conversations from the pews behind us. "Such a shock. He seemed so healthy. Wonder what will happen to the business. Heard there's quite a bit of money involved." Money. Even at Daniel's funeral, people were talking about money. I wanted to turn around and scream at them, to tell them that no amount of money could fill the hole in my chest where my husband's laugh used to live. But I sat frozen, trapped in my grief and their expectations. As we filed out of the cathedral, Helen's hand closed around my elbow like a vice. "We need to talk," she murmured, her breath cold against my ear. "Soon." 3 days after the funeral, Helen arrived uninvited at my door. She didn't knock politely or wait for me to answer. She had her own key, something Daniel had given her years ago, that I'd always resented but never had the courage to ask him to take back. I found her in my living room, sitting in Daniel's leather chair as if she owned it, as if she owned everything. She wore a cream-colored cashmere sweater and pearls, her makeup flawless despite the early hour. In her manicured hands, she held a weathered manila folder that looked like it had been waiting years for this moment. She didn't offer condolences. She didn't ask how I was coping. She simply opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, placing it on the coffee table between us with the precision of a chess master making a winning move. A change of beneficiary form. My eyes struggled to focus on the document. The words seemed to swim on the page. Lincoln Life Insurance Company, policy number 4478291, death benefit, $5 million. And there in the box marked, primary beneficiary, not my name, but hers, Helen Margaret Carter. At the bottom, Daniel's familiar signature sprawled across the line. The same signature that had signed our marriage certificate, our mortgage papers, countless birthday cards. And beside it, a blue ink notary seal, official and damning. You see? Helen's voice was ice wrapped in silk.
Daniel wanted me to handle everything. You were never meant to have this money, dear. He knew you wouldn't know what to do with it.
The word dear dripped from her lips like poison honey. She had always called me that, even when Daniel was alive, but never with affection. It was her way of diminishing me, of making me feel small and inadequate in comparison to her refined, old-money elegance. She slid another set of papers across the table. Sign these release papers and I'll give you a little something to start over. Say, $75,000. It's generous, considering the circumstances. Don't make this ugly, Sarah, ugly. As if my grief, my shock, my very existence in this house that Daniel and I had chosen together was somehow unseemly. As if my 12 years of marriage were just an inconvenient obstacle to her inheritance. Her words cut deeper than anything I'd felt at the funeral. No grief, no compassion. Just paperwork, greed, and a mother's icy smile that had never, not once in 12 years, been warm when directed at me. I remembered the first time I'd met Helen, when Daniel brought me home for Christmas during our second year of dating. She had looked me up and down like I was a piece of furniture she was considering purchasing and finding wanting. She's sweet, she had told Daniel later, the word sweet delivered like a diagnosis of terminal mediocrity. The following morning, Helen's attorney arrived at my door. Richard Blackwood was everything Central Casting would order for a corporate lawyer. Silver-haired, expensively suited, with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. He carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my car, and spoke in measured tones that had been honed by decades of high-stakes negotiations. We sat in my breakfast nook, the same spot where Daniel and I had shared thousands of morning conversations, where we'd argued about whose turn it was to take out the trash, where we'd planned our modest vacations and dreamed about the children we'd never had. Now, this stranger sat in Daniel's chair, converting our intimate space into a boardroom. Mrs. Carter, he began, his voice polite, but rehearsed, like a script written long ago and performed countless times. I understand this is a difficult time for you. Grief can cloud our judgment, make us think we're entitled to things that were never really ours. The condescension in his tone made my teeth clench. He spoke to me like I was a child having a tantrum over a toy that didn't belong to me. He opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency and withdrew a stack of documents.
If you sign quietly, you'll walk away with $75,000. It's quite generous considering the circumstances. Mrs. Helen Carter is being very gracious.
Gracious. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. There was nothing gracious about a woman who couldn't wait 3 days after her son's funeral to claim his money. However, he continued, his tone shifting slightly, becoming sharper. If you choose to contest this, well, we'll have no choice but to examine certain aspects of your marriage more closely. Questions might arise about undue influence, about your motives, about why your husband felt the need to exclude you from his final wishes. I felt the blood drain from my face. He was threatening me. Not with violence or obvious intimidation, but with something worse. The systematic destruction of my reputation, my memories, the very foundation of my marriage. The newspapers do love a good story, he added with that practiced smile.
Wealthy businessman cuts wife out of will. One has to wonder what she might have done to deserve such treatment.
My hands began to shake. This wasn't just about money. It was about rewriting history, about turning my love story into a scandal, about making me the villain in my own life. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my voice. Is this a threat? He smiled thinly, adjusting his gold cufflinks with the casual arrogance of a man who had never lost a battle he cared about winning. Call it a choice, Mrs. Carter. The easy way, or the hard way. I assure you, you don't want the hard way. That night, I sat alone in the dim living room, the release forms on one side of the coffee table, our wedding photo on the other. In the picture, Daniel was laughing at something I had whispered in his ear during our reception. His eyes were crinkled with joy, his hand possessive and protective on my waist. The man in that photo looked like someone who would move heaven and earth for me, not someone who would cut me out of his life insurance policy without a word. But doubt is an insidious thing. It creeps in through the smallest cracks and expands until it fills every space in your mind. Maybe Helen was right. Maybe I had never really known my husband at all. Maybe I was just the naive girl from Ohio who had somehow convinced herself that a man like Daniel Carter could really love someone like me. I thought about all the times Helen had made little comments over the years. Daniel could have married anyone, you know. It's so sweet how he takes care of you. I do hope you appreciate what a catch my son is. Had those been warnings? Had she seen something I was too blind to see? I stared at that signature for hours, holding a magnifying glass like some amateur detective in a bad novel. It looked like Daniel's hand. Those perfect loops on the D, the confident slash through the T in Carter, the slight rightward slant that came from years of writing at a tilted desk. But handwriting can be forged. I knew that. The question was whether Helen Carter, for all her faults, was capable of such an elaborate deception. The woman who sent handwritten thank you notes on cream cardstock. The woman who had never, in 12 years, shown me anything but cold politeness. Could that same woman be capable of fraud? But then I saw the date on the document. March 14th. The date hit me like a physical blow. March 14th. I knew that date. How could I forget it? Daniel had been in the hospital, hooked to an IV, heavily sedated after a severe pneumonia scare that had terrified us both. I had spent 3 days in that uncomfortable vinyl chair beside his bed, spooning lukewarm broth into his mouth when he could barely keep his eyes open. I remembered everything about those days. The antiseptic smell that clung to my clothes. The way Daniel's hand felt so fragile in mine. How he kept drifting in and out of consciousness, mumbling about work projects that made no sense. There was absolutely no way he could have signed any document, let alone something as important as a change of beneficiary form. The memory came flooding back with perfect clarity. Daniel, pale and weak against the white hospital pillows, trying to make a joke about the terrible jello they served for dessert. His hand had been shaking so badly he couldn't even hold a spoon steady. How was he supposed to have produced that perfect, confident signature? And then, like a gift from beyond the grave, another memory surfaced. We had been lying in bed one Sunday morning about 6 months ago, reading the newspaper and drinking coffee. Daniel had been telling me about some office drama, how his secretary had forged her supervisor's signature on a vacation request. Promise me something, he had said, suddenly serious, setting down his coffee cup and turning to look at me with those warm brown eyes. If my mother ever waves some official-looking form at you, check the witnesses. Check everything twice. I'd never sign anything important behind your back. At the time, it had seemed like such an odd thing to say. I had laughed and told him he was being paranoid. But now, sitting in our empty house with Helen's papers spread before me, that casual comment felt like a warning. Like Daniel had somehow known this day would come. Had he suspected his mother of something? Had there been other incidents I didn't know about? I tried to remember other strange moments, other offhand comments that might have been clues. There was the time Helen had found Daniel's power of attorney papers and suggested he update them. The way she always seemed to know details about our finances that Daniel swore he hadn't shared. The expensive gifts that appeared in our house, a painting here, a piece of jewelry there that Helen claimed were early inheritance items, but that Daniel never seemed to remember agreeing to accept. The joke didn't feel funny anymore. It felt like a roadmap. The next morning, I drove to the notary office listed on the seal. It was in a strip mall on the outskirts of town, wedged between a nail salon and a check-cashing business. The kind of place that didn't ask too many questions, as long as the fee was paid in cash. The office was smaller than I had expected, with faded wood paneling and a waiting area that consisted of 3 mismatched chairs and a coffee table covered with outdated magazines. The air smelled of old coffee and something vaguely medicinal. A young man emerged from the back room when I rang the bell. He couldn't have been more than 25, with nervous eyes and the kind of sparse beard that suggested he was trying to look older and more professional than he felt. When I mentioned Daniel Carter's name, his face went pale. Are you his wife?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am." I kept my voice steady, authoritative. "I need to ask you about a document my husband supposedly signed here on March 14th. He shifted nervously, his eyes darting away from mine like a guilty child caught in a lie. I'm not supposed to discuss client business. My husband is dead," I said quietly, "and I think someone may have committed fraud using his name." That got his attention. He glanced around the empty office as if Helen Carter might materialize from the shadows, then gestured for me to follow him to his desk. "Did you see my husband sign this form?" I asked, placing the beneficiary change document on his cluttered desk. He stared at the paper for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly. Finally, he whispered,
"No, I never saw him. His mother brought it in. Already signed."
My heart began to race. This was it, the crack in their perfect story. "She said it was urgent," he continued, his voice getting smaller with each word. "That her son was very sick and couldn't come in person. She paid me extra to just stamp it. I knew it was wrong, but she seemed so commanding. And the money..." I pulled out my phone, my hand surprisingly steady. "Would you be willing to repeat that for recording?" He looked terrified, but after a moment, he nodded. "I can't live with this anymore, especially knowing he's gone." I pressed record, and his voice trembled through the speaker. "I never saw Daniel Carter sign anything. His mother, Helen Carter, brought the form in already signed. She paid me to notarize it without witnessing the signature. I knew it was wrong. It was all I needed. A crack in their perfect story. But as I left that shabby office, I realized this was just the beginning. Helen Carter had money, lawyers, and decades of experience manipulating people. I had a recording from a scared kid in a strip mall. It was a start, but it wasn't nearly enough. That night, I couldn't sleep. Instead, I sat at Daniel's desk in his home office, surrounded by files and documents, trying to piece together a timeline. If Helen had forged Daniel's signature, there had to be other evidence. She couldn't have been perfect. I started with the obvious: Daniel's medical records from the hospital stay. Getting them required a death certificate, a lawyer, and more paperwork than I thought possible. But eventually, I had them. The records were damning. Daniel had been heavily sedated with morphine and Ativan from March 13th through March 16th. On March 14th specifically, the day the form was supposedly signed, his chart showed he had barely conscious, requiring assistance to drink water. But I needed more. I needed to prove that Helen had access to documents with Daniel's signature. I needed to show motive. I needed to build a case that would stand up against her expensive lawyers. I spent the next week going through every document in Daniel's office. Bank statements, contracts, old birthday cards, anything with his signature. In there, in a file marked insurance, I found something interesting. The original beneficiary form from 2015, naming me as the primary beneficiary. Daniel's signature on that document looked identical to the one on Helen's form. Too identical. It was as if someone had traced it. Helen called the next family meeting for the following Thursday. She insisted we meet at her house, a sprawling Tudor mansion in the city's most exclusive neighborhood, where she could play hostess and maintain the illusion of control. I had been to Helen's house countless times over the years, but I never felt comfortable there. Everything was perfect, expensive, and cold. The kind of place where you were afraid to touch anything because it might be a priceless antique. Persian rugs covered gleaming hardwood floors. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms on cream-colored walls lined with oil paintings of stern-faced Carter ancestors. Helen sat in her usual spot at the head of her dining room table, pearls gleaming against a navy silk blouse. Two lawyers flanked on either side of her, like well-dressed bodyguards. Richard Blackwood was there, of course, along with another man I didn't recognize. Younger, sharper, with the hungry look of someone eager to make his reputation on a high-profile case. "Sarah," Helen said as I entered, not bothering to stand. "I do hope you've come to your senses. This whole situation has been terribly trying for all of us." Trying. As if my grief was an inconvenience to her schedule. I sat across from them, placing my purse carefully on the polished mahogany surface. "I have come to some conclusions, yes." "Wonderful," Blackwood said, already reaching for his briefcase. "The papers are ready for your signature." "Actually," I said, reaching into my purse, "I have some papers of my own." I placed my phone on the table and pressed play. The notary's confession filled the elegant room. I never saw Daniel Carter sign anything. His mother, Helen Carter, brought the form in already signed. She paid me to notarize it without witnessing the signature. I knew it was wrong. The silence that followed was deafening. Helen's face went through a fascinating series of expressions: surprise, anger, and then something I had never seen before: fear. That's inadmissible," the younger lawyer sputtered. "He was obviously coerced into making that statement." "Was he?" I asked mildly. I opened my folder and laid out the hospital records, because these show that Daniel was heavily sedated on March 14th, the date your client claims he signed this document. According to his medical chart, he couldn't even hold a cup of water without assistance. Helen's composure was cracking. A flush was creeping up her neck and her hands were trembling slightly. "Sarah, you don't understand." "Sarah? Oh, I understand perfectly." I pulled out the comparative signature analysis I'd had done by a handwriting expert. Another expense I couldn't really afford, but one that was proving invaluable. "I understand that the signature on your form is traced from Daniel's 2015 beneficiary designation. I understand that you had access to that original document, and I understand that this isn't a mistake. This is forgery, insurance fraud, a federal crime." Blackwood was shuffling papers frantically, whispering urgently to his colleague. The younger lawyer's face had gone pale. "If you pursue this," Blackwood said, his practiced composure slipping, "it will be your word against Mrs. Carter's. She's a respected member of this community." "And I'm just the gold-digging wife, right?" I interrupted. "Except now, I have evidence. I have the notary's confession. I have medical records, proving Daniel couldn't have signed anything that day. I have handwriting analysis, showing the signature was traced." "What do you have, Mr. Blackwood? Besides empty threats and a client who committed fraud?" "Stash." The lawyers exchanged glances, their expensive suits suddenly looking like costumes in a play that had gone horribly wrong. Without another word, they closed their briefcases and quietly excused themselves, leaving Helen and me alone in her perfect dining room. For the first time in 12 years, Helen Carter had nothing to say. After the lawyers left, Helen and I sat in silence for a long moment. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, marking time in a room that felt frozen. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the absence of her legal armor. "Why?" I asked finally. The word came out as barely a whisper. Helen straightened in her chair, her chin lifting in a gesture of defiance I had seen 1,000 times. But when she spoke, her voice lacked its usual steel. "You never understood Daniel," she said. "Not really. He was brilliant, destined for great things, but he was soft when it came to you. He would have given you everything, left nothing for the family legacy, for the Carter name." "That's the Carter name?" I felt a laugh bubbling up in my throat, bitter, incredulous. "He's dead, Helen. The Carter name dies with him, whether I have the money or not." "No." She shook her head firmly. "There are charities, institutions, buildings that could bear his name, important things, not just domestic comfort." Domestic comfort. As if 12 years of marriage, of love, of partnership, could be dismissed so casually. "Did you plan this?" I asked. "While he was alive, did you plan to steal from me?" Helen's facade finally cracked completely. "He changed that beneficiary designation when he married you," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "Without consulting me, without considering the family. I always meant to discuss it with him, to make him see reason, but there was never a right time. And then he got sick, and then he died, and I thought it would be simpler for everyone if things were handled properly." Properly. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. "You forged your dead son's signature and you call that proper?" She had no answer for that. For the first time in 12 years, Helen Carter was speechless. 3 weeks later, the insurance company reviewed my evidence. The claims adjuster, a tired-looking woman named Patricia Mills, spread my documents across her desk like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "I've been investigating insurance fraud for 15 years, and I've rarely seen a case this clear-cut. The policy will be reinstated with you as the rightful beneficiary. The $5 million was mine, not out of greed, but out of truth. But the victory felt hollow. Daniel was still gone. Helen's actions hadn't just stolen money. They had poisoned the well of my grief, forced me to spend precious emotional energy fighting battles instead of healing. I could have been vindictive. I could have pressed charges, watched Helen Carter face criminal prosecution for fraud. Instead, I chose a different path. The notary received immunity in exchange for his testimony. Helen quietly transferred some assets to cover the legal costs and disappeared from my life as completely as if she had never existed. With the insurance money, I didn't buy a mansion or take exotic trips. Instead, I started the Daniel Carter Foundation for Widow Advocacy, helping women like me fight fraudulent claims and forged documents. Women who found themselves alone, facing legal battles they never expected. Armed with nothing but truth against well-funded lies, the foundation became my purpose, my way of turning Daniel's death into something meaningful. We helped dozens of women in the first year alone. Women whose husbands' families had tried to cut them out of wills. Women whose business partners had forged documents. Women who had been told to be reasonable and accept pennies instead of their rightful inheritance. Each case reminded me of that night I sat alone with Helen's papers, doubting everything I thought I knew about my marriage. No woman should have to face that doubt alone. On my desk in the Foundation's office, I keep a note Daniel scribbled just days before he died. I had found it tucked inside his favorite book, To Kill a Mockingbird, the book he reread every year, the book that had taught him about justice and courage. His handwriting was shaky from the medication he'd been taking for what we didn't know were his final days, but the message was clear. For Sarah, trust but verify. Even the ones closest to you. Love is not enough. Wisdom and strength are needed too. You have both, even when you don't know it. Dimly, he had known. Somehow, even facing his own mortality, Daniel had known I would need that reminder. He had known that love alone wouldn't be enough to protect me from the people who would see his death as an opportunity. He was right about everything, about Helen, about the importance of fighting for truth, about my own strength, even when I felt like I was drowning in doubt and grief. But most of all, he was right about trust. It's precious precisely because it can be broken. The trick is learning to verify without becoming cynical, to be wise without losing your capacity for love. I learned that lesson the hard way, but I learned it completely. And now I spend my days teaching it to other women who find themselves in that terrible place between trust and betrayal, between love and loss, between truth and the lies that people tell when they think no one is strong enough to fight back. We are stronger than they think. We are stronger than we know. And the truth, when we have the courage to fight for it, always wins in the end.